I'm representing the Indigenous Environmental Network at this event, and also in general Indigenous people as we look at our role in a lot of the conversation.
So what is that role?
Well, some is an advocacy for certainly networking and working together. Part of that role is explaining our Indigenous worldview, certainly, which oftentimes is missing from the conversation, and how things are connected, and history is sometimes missing. So we want to emphasize that as we have conversations with non-Indigenous people about who our Indigenous people are, about global history, world history, as well as our own history in our communities.
So IEN is one of the organizing members
Yes.
of this Convergence,
Yes,
and I believe the Shawnee Defense and Global Justice Ecology Project.
Primary.
Right. So this started off, I think, how long have you been working on it?
Oh, just about the last 6 months.
Okay.
Yeah.
Overall, I think it's taken some of the main the organizations themselves maybe a year or a half to put into place.
Yes.
What do you think? You've been working on it for about 6 months. A success?
Oh, absolutely. The effort is pretty dynamic, and getting the dynamic people to collaborate and cooperate is kind of difficult at times. But the leadership has certainly done the deep dive as far as communicating. They've had to learn a lot in the process, and we're build off the mistakes that might have been made as far as just outreach, style, and dynamics. But I think the overall successful is where we're at today. The success we have.
So, seeing some old friends, right?
Yes, sir.
Seeing some new friends?
Many, yeah,
Okay.
many new friends.
So, have you gained anything in perspective from this experience?
Well, I think one of the primary pieces is something actually that we've been advocating for a long time. Is we're not the only ones who have a certain impact as Indigenous people, and we talked about the 5 M's have been an impact on our worldview, and originally we thought it was just Indigenous people, but we find out it's everyone. And the 5 M's are the military, the merchant, the missionary, the media, and the man have impacted on all of us. And it's not about a specific element of each. Merchant is commerce, not necessarily capitalism, but commerce. Missionary isn't necessarily Christianity, but religion and the beliefs and all. So that's been a primary piece.
So this sort of came together as forest and climate, but then issues of race, colonialism, ageism, racism.
Many isms.
Many isms.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think everyone got a seat at the table? Any complaints about that, or just a post-mortem on that?
Yeah.
How did it all come together?
Well, the dynamic of the group is if they see it as an omission, they're going to bring it up. In a good way, there's variables on how you bring up omissions, But I think overall, there's been a fair representation. There's certainly always, I wouldn't say a gap, but a weak gap. So, one person there represents everyone on that area. Well, 2 or 3, and representation is always a difficult task. But overall, I believe the organizers were conscious of the need for inclusion and avoid exclusion, of course, which I think they've done a very good job of that. I think as we were together, we found out more and more the dynamics of inclusion are sometimes the detail is there, as I say.
So this conference broke out into strategic groups, strategy groups.
Yes.
What do you mind saying what strategy group you were with?
With the solutions, the real solutions, of course. Then we have to reframe what is real, and so our discussion is around reframing a bit of what is a real solution and what is a solution in this day and age.
One of the big things in messaging originally was this is not a conference, this is a convergence.
Mm-hmm.
Did it end up being a conference? Did it end up being a convergence? I mean, is this different? Can you point to anything a little bit different about this?
I think the parties invited is kind of recruiting, in a sense, recruiting so that there's activists involved and know the subject in their particular areas, and trying to get a regional representation. So I still see it as a convergence in bringing in folks who there's assumptions about what they already know, so you already can build off of that rather than how many people know this, that, and so we had a large representation of different subjects where there's some, you could refer to them as, can you give us a little more background on that? And then they'll have legislation, they'll have policy work, they'll have build a broader understanding of issues. So I still say it's a convergence. Yeah.
Do you think there's relationships being built and there's going to be impact moving forward?
Certainly networking is one of our concerns. After we leave here, as many meetings in a general sense happen, and people have, oh, that was a great meeting, and then they go home and another file. And so we're emphasizing the issue of networking and the importance of networking and trying to set up some institutional structures so that'll happen.
There's a lot of people here, right, that have some interesting stories. Have you been surprised by any stories or informed by any stories, or like, I really didn't know that was going on, inspired or anything like that?
Oh, I've always noticed the stories are always interesting because of how someone's been involved and engaged, and surprised somewhat some of the issues that are so far away, but they're right here in your own backyard. And so the identity of, well, the distance is smaller, because I realize, well, that's in Tennessee, but it's happening right up the road.
Well, that's it. That's interesting that you bring up backyard. So, what's in your backyard? What are you dealing with?
Well, in our community, we have a checkerboard. Well, I live in the Oneida Indian Reservation, and we have a checkerboard reservation. So there's Indian, non-Indian land. So there's Indian issues and non-Indian issues right next door. We have superfund site that was checked off the superfund list through a lot of the politics and economics from a local paper mill. And ironically, it was called the Fort Howard paper mill years ago. And Fort Howard, of course, there's a fort there to deal with the Indians differently than just a paper mill. So we have an interesting history when you go back into not only the history of the site, but then the history of the communities. And that's one of the bigger ones on a reservation. And then we have a landfill on the reservation. So we have a, did they happen to just, were they planned to be on a reservation? There's great debate to that.
So when you say that, where they planned, so there's the idea, maybe you hear the term EJ,
Yes.
which I believe refers to environmental justice, and you have issues of environmental racism. So you say, were they planned there? So do you think that's I'll just be direct. Do you think there is environmental racism?
Well, I think when you talk about environmental justice, we need to talk about environmental injustice, which leads to a better understanding of what is just and equitable, fairness. All those points come up as well. I think there is environmental racism. I think there's documents about that. Research has been done around it. And again, who's the author of it? Certainly, if I send my environmental justice issue, it had an indigenous tint to it. But at the same time, there's more and more, I think, research being done on what's the foundation of the injustice, as much as from color, geography, gender. So there's an issue of justice that's being better understood and injustice at the same time. So I think we're seeing a relationship between the two that's elevating the conversation about what are we really talking about. So it happens to be indigenous here, maybe Spanish there, maybe Anglos in the South, So it's getting many colors, I think, to the conversation.
Is there anything that I haven't brought up that you'd like to address? I mean, you're an organizer in this event. Is there anything that I haven't asked that you think should be asked? What would you like to say? I'm opening it up here.
Well, I think there's an old equation of land, labor, capital that kind of has contributed to us being in the situation we're in. See it as a crisis, conflict, however you want to see where we are today. So I think that land, labor, capital equation has brought us into this a bit. And now what we need is a new equation for the future, which is land, labor, capital, culture. And I think once you add culture to it, however you want to define it, by a region, by a race of people in a certain area, it's going to change how we see the land and the labor issues and the capital issues. So I think that's one of the key points that I think needs to be revisited, re-emphasized. The other one I'd add is our way of thinking about each other and about the land certainly is another part of it. Then you have the old school, who kind of, and not just about age either, but just old school thinking. It might be your father, grandfather, but it's old school thinking. And then there's the new school, which has a lot of technology and has a lot of insights and energy, different. Then there's a big group of no school. just don't have a clue, ain't interested in any clues, and that's the group we need to try and address, which leads to our future school. What is the future school that we need to have? What's the thinking that needs to be there, and what's the science involvement? Because there's a debate between indigenous knowledge and science that we need to embrace differently. My grandson has an idea the other day. He plays with Legos, and he said, "Grandpa, I'm going to make a brain ray gun." A brain ray gun. I said, "What is that?" He says, "It's a ray gun. I can just point at you and you'll be smarter." I said, "Give me 2 of those," I told him. So he keeps me going. And that alludes, just last point, is to a way of thinking about 7th-generation philosophy. I think at one time, it wasn't just an indigenous point of view, it's about planning and looking at the future. And I believe it's kind of been interpreted that way, just looking into the future. And not many people can do that. There's a few gods and very intelligent big heads who can see into the future like that. But we're seeing it more in a reframed theme again, as to here I am with my knowledge, skills, and abilities, and then my parents, grandparents, or great-grandparents, if you're lucky now. So there's 3 and 1 is 4. And then looking at the future, there's my children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren, about what it's for. So trying to build off of that collective intelligence, I think, is a key to moving into the future in a good way for all of us, including the environment.
Thank you.
Thank you.